In this video, I want to show you how to knit a baby blanket design that I am calling Fearne. This is a brilliant design if you're looking for something really sleek and modern because it combines stockinette and reverse stockinette stitch to create these really cute little squares of texture nestled amongst a sea of just plain stockinette. So if you're looking for a smooth, clean design, this could be the one for you. Fearne is a nice and easy 10-row repeat, so you've not got a really long pattern repeat to deal with, and it is an 8-stitch pattern repeat along the width, so again it's nothing that is going to be too overly complex for someone who is a confident beginner. By a confident beginner I mean if you know how to knit and purl, then you can make this blanket. To knit a blanket the same size as mine, which is 60 centimeters wide and 80 centimeters long, you are going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. For those of you who are not UK based, that is light worsted or 3-weight yarn, but you can knit this blanket in any weight yarn that you want. You're just going to need to adjust your cast on amount. You are also going to need a set of circular needles 4mm wide and about 80 to 120 centimeters long to accommodate the number of stitches that you are casting on. You're going to need some embroidery scissors to deal with those ends. And you are also going to need 2 stitch markers to mark where your central panel starts and your garter stitch border starts. So it just marks that side nice and defined so that you don't have to think about where your garter stitch borders start and end. So without further ado, grab some yarn, grab some needles, and let's get knitting. Whenever I knit a blanket that has an inbuilt border, I like to treat the pattern multiple for the middle textured panel completely separate to the stitches that I cast on for that side border. In the case of this blanket, the pattern multiple for that textured middle pattern is 8 plus 5. So you want to cast on in multiples of 8, add on 5 stitches, and then for my side garter stitch borders I add a total of 18 stitches, which makes 9 for either side border. For the blanket I showed you in the introduction, I cast on a total of 135 stitches. That is including accommodating the 18 stitches for the side border. So if you want to make a blanket just like mine that is 60 centimeters wide or thereabouts, you'll need to cast on 135 stitches. If you want to adjust that size, you're going to need to use that pattern multiple and cast on more or less stitches depending on how big or small you want your blanket to be. For this tutorial, I'm just going to cast on a small sample. I like to use the long tail cast on method, but this blanket will also work if you are using a different type of cast on, so please just feel free to use whichever cast on method you feel comfortable with. The first part of the blanket that we want to work is the bottom garter stitch edging, and for that we need to work 15 rows in exactly the same way. You want to knit all the way across until you have 1 stitch left to work on your left hand needle. That is the only stitch of the row that we work slightly differently, so just knit all the way across until you have just 1 stitch left to work. To get a nice neat side edge, instead of knitting the final stitch of the row, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. The first step of that process is to get your working yarn to the front of your work. If, like me, you're a continental knitter, it's easy. You just pick up your working yarn with that right hand needle, and then the next part is to slip the stitch purlwise. So you want to pop your right hand needle into the stitch as if to purl, so from right to left, not by picking it up from left to right. And then once your stitch is nice and firmly on that right hand needle, you can pull your left hand needle out and you will have moved that stitch successfully over from the left needle to the right needle. The last part of the process is to make sure that that working yarn is definitely at the front of your work and isn't looped over the needle and accidentally creating a new stitch. The next 14 rows are worked in exactly the same way, so I'm going to leave you to go ahead and knit 14 more rows like this one, and then we will move on to tackling the main body of the blanket. After your 15th row, you should have a piece of knitting that looks a little bit like this, and now we're ready to head into the main section of our blanket where we work that nice textured panel. The first time we work row 1 of this 10-row repeat, we are going to do a little bit of prep work by adding our stitch markers in to define these side borders, but every time you work it after this first time, instead of placing markers, you are obviously just going to slip those markers across. Row 1 is a right side row and you want to start by knitting the first 9 stitches. Then you want to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle. Then you want to knit across until you have 9 stitches left on your left hand needle to work. So you want to knit until 9 stitches before the end of the row. At this point you are going to introduce your second stitch marker and again pop it on your right hand needle and then knit the next 8 stitches. That final stitch of the row, just like with our bottom garter stitch edging, you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. And that completes row 1. Row 2, you start by knitting the first 9 stitches. That should take you to your first marker. You want to slip that marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to purl all the way across until you hit your second marker. Once you get to it, you're going to slip that second marker over and then you want to knit the next 8 stitches after the marker. The final stitch, again you're going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front to carry on that nice braided edge up the side. Row 3 is the same as row 1, so you are going to knit every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch. You're going to slip your markers as you come across them, and then don't forget that for the final stitch of the row you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front instead of knitting it. Row 4 starts with knitting the 9 stitches that should take you to your first stitch marker. Slip the stitch marker over and then you want to purl across to your second stitch marker. Once you reach your second marker, you're going to slip it over and then knit the next 8 stitches. The final stitch of the row you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 5 is another nice and easy one. You are going to knit every single stitch all the way across with the exception of the final stitch. That final stitch you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front, and then don't forget to slip your markers over as you come to them to keep marking out those side borders. Row 6 starts with knitting the 9 stitches before your stitch marker. Then you want to slip that stitch marker over and purl all the way across to your second marker. Slip your second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave you with 1 stitch left to work, and you are going to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 7, you're going to knit all the way across, slip your markers as you come to them, and then instead of knitting that final stitch, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. So knit all the way across with the exception of the final stitch. That final stitch you're going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. Rows 8, 9 and 10 are the rows that create our little textured squares, so the pattern repeat for those is perhaps a little bit more in depth than the pattern repeat for the first 7 rows. So row 8, you start by knitting the first 9 stitches. Slip that marker over as you come to it, and then you want to purl the next 5 stitches. Then the 8 stitch pattern repeat that you repeat over until your next marker is knit 3 and then purl 5, and you repeat those 8 stitches until you hit your second marker, which should be after a purl 5. You should be able to work complete pattern repeats across and hit your next marker after a purl 5. So that's knit 3, purl 5 all the way across to your second marker. Slip your second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish the row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 9, you want to start by knitting the 9 stitches before the marker. Slip that marker over and then knit 5 stitches. Now you want to repeat the next 8 stitches until you hit your second marker, and they are purl 3 and knit 5. And you should be able to repeat those 8 stitches until you hit your second marker, and you should hit your second marker after a knit 5, so you should be able to complete a full pattern of 8 stitches at the point that you hit your marker. Slip that second marker over and knit 8 stitches. And then the final stitch you slip purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 10 is the final row in our repeat, and you start it by knitting 9 stitches. That should take you to your marker. Slip that marker over, and then just like with row 8, you are going to purl the next 5 stitches. Then you want to work across, repeating knit 3, purl 5 all the way across until you hit your second marker, and you should hit that second marker after a purl 5. So your 8 stitch repeat is knit 3, purl 5. Slip the second marker over as you come to it and then knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave you with just 1 stitch left to work, and that one you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. So that is our repeat, and that's the 10 rows that you would now go away and repeat as many times as you like to achieve the size of blanket that you want. If you're wanting to replicate my blanket that I showed you in the introduction, then I repeated these a total of 22 times. So I would now go away and repeat these 10 rows 21 times more. You can work out how many repeats you have knitted by counting the number of these little squares up your work, because the end of each square marks the end of a 10 row repeat. Then when you are ready to start finishing off your blanket, when it is about 6 or 7 centimeters shorter than you want your final length to be, you want to repeat rows 1 to 7 once more and then stop, and that is the point that you would go to move on to knitting your border once you have finished row 1 to 7, and that is to give us a matching set of stockinette above the final square, just like we have here before the first square. And without doing that, you would head straight into your edge without actually having any space above your final little square. I've gone away and I've worked another set of 10 rows, and then I've worked rows 1 to 7 once more. So you can see that by working rows 1 to 7 once more, your project will be symmetrical top and bottom before you start your garter stitch border at the top. The garter stitch border for the top edge is worked in pretty much the same way as the garter stitch border for the bottom edge. The only difference is that at the end of our border we're going to need to cast off, and I will walk you through that once we get there. So for the garter stitch border on this particular blanket, you want to work 15 rows in exactly the same way. You're going to start by knitting every stitch until the final stitch. Your first row of your border should be a wrong side row, so you should have the wrong side of your work facing you as you knit this row. As you come to your stitch markers on this row, you can get rid of them, but we don't need them anymore. And you want to knit all the way across until you have just that one final stitch left to work. Just like with the rest of our project, this final stitch here, instead of knitting it, we're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front, and that keeps the nice braided edge that you get all the way up these long sides. So that's row 1 of our border done, and you want to go away and knit another 14 in exactly the same way, so that you've worked a total of 15 rows. After 15 rows, you should have the right side of your work facing you, like I've got here, and you should be able to count 8 garter ridges of border. And at that point, when you've got a right side row and your 8 garter ridges after those 15 rows, we are going to cast off. The final row of the blanket that we need to work is our cast off row, and the type of cast off we are going to be using for this project is a really nice and easy basic knitted cast off. If you don't already know how to work the basic knitted cast off, then I do have a separate video that goes over it in a lot of detail, and I'm going to link it up at the top here now for you. But for those of you that are more familiar, we're just going to jump straight into the cast off, and I will go over it very briefly in this video. To start your cast off, you want to knit the first 2 stitches. Make sure that when you're knitting your stitches on this cast off row that you keep your tension nice and relaxed, because if you don't, your cast off edge will be too tight and that will leave the top edge of your work pulling in and it won't lay flat. Once you've knitted 2 stitches, you want to pop your left hand needle into the first of those 2 stitches that you knitted, grab the stitch and lift it up and over the second stitch that you knitted and off the needle. So you go from 2 stitches on this needle down to 1, and you have lifted that first stitch over the second stitch. Then you want to knit 1 more stitch and then repeat by lifting the first stitch over the second stitch, and then that is the process that you carry on all the way along the row. You knit 1 and lift 1 all the way to the end of the row until you have no stitches left to work on your left hand needle and just 1 loop left on this right hand needle. When you reach this final stitch, you can break your yarn and leave a nice long tail to sew in after you're done. And then I finish off by pulling up this stitch to make the loop nice and big and removing my knitting needle because I don't need that anymore. And then I just pull the tail through that loop and then gently pull it to tighten and secure it nicely. And then once you sew your end in, that is not even visible. A couple of final bits and bobs before I go. For those of you that like to have written instructions to follow along with, I have left a written pattern on my blog and I will link that down in the description below for you. I also often get asked if a pattern is reversible. In the case of this blanket, Fearne, the pattern is not reversible. 99% of the time when you are knitting a blanket in stockinette stitch or any form of stockinette stitch, it will not be reversible. As you can see here, we have reverse stockinette where our stockinette sections are, and then where our textured squares are, we have stockinette stitch. So this blanket definitely is not ugly on the reverse side, but it is also not reversible. I also get asked if you can knit this blanket in any weight of yarn. The answer to that is absolutely yes. You will just need to adjust your cast on amount of stitches to accommodate whether or not you are using a thicker or thinner yarn. But absolutely, this blanket will work with any weight of yarn. It's just that I prefer to knit my blankets with double knit yarn. But if you prefer a different weight, then please go ahead and use that weight of yarn. You're just going to need to change the amount of stitches that you cast on. And that's how you knit yourself a Fearne blanket. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I would love it if you would give it a thumbs up. And if you're looking for yet more project inspiration, then I'm going to link another video here now that I think you will enjoy just as much. That's all from me for today, and I'll see you again for another video soon.